Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep. Well, Alistair, I'm sensing some energy from you today. What's up with you?
Oh, well, Juddy, I'm pretty excited to someone who I've worked in the industry with over time in different facets. With us here today is Robyn Dynes, and we are looking at key research themes through the decades and tracking a marvellous career that's still got a lot to offer too.
Welcome, Robyn.
Thanks, guys. Nice to be here.
No, I'm quite excited because you've obviously had a very busy year at the end of last year with some of the themes and topics you covered, particularly at New Zealand Grasslands. You shared with us a lot of your history in the grassland industry. But what I love so much about some of your history is that you go all the way back to Lincoln.
Indeed, of course.
And almost not quite crossover with us, but very close. But a lot of the influences that were happening out of the end of the 80s all sort of sat all over our starts of our lives and our careers in the agricultural sector. And it would be interesting to see how that started and when you ended up in the early parts of your career.
Yes, you young things.
Yeah. So I hope, and this is probably if you overarch this, right? I hope that in the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to try and transcend what were the key research themes, what were the key issues that we're facing agriculture, both here in New Zealand, but we're going to hear a little bit about what was happening in Australia as well, through those periods, and a little bit about how we solve those, or when we've moved on, and what were the really chunky things that we had to try and solve in that.
I'm quite excited about that because, to be fair, each decade has been really, really quite different in our careers, and I can't think of a better time to start than the 1980s. And what was going on in the 1980s when you were just starting your decision making, and what was going on in the world at that point, and sent you on this path?
Yeah, look, exactly. And so I was a student at Lincoln in the 80s, and those were formative years. It took a while, a couple of decades to really see the value I got out of my Lincoln degree. But the 80s was a time of turmoil, wasn't it? We had the 1984, the sort of changes that we saw through that phase. And, we finished Lincoln at a time in the mid-80s where having a job, you were fortunate. So we had an industry in turmoil, really, didn't we? And then we had
a Minister of Finance saying that agriculture was a sunset industry.
Exactly.
And we had Carlos Days, I remember that.
That might have been a little earlier.
That was a bit early. Yeah.
But, we had the 1960s and 70s, and coming out of the Second World War, we had a government that saw the growth opportunity for exports through the 60s and 70s. And then we saw, as globally the wobbles happened, we saw those incentive payments to farmers were quite diverse, and they were underpinning our industries, weren't they? So we get to the 1984, and I guess the wheels sort of came off, didn't they? Mm. And so, but the wheels didn't come off. We came to 84 and we saw a paradigm shift, which is probably the greatest we will see in our time. Maybe. Let's debate that later. Yeah. So that shift to a free market economy and everything that has come from that, and the efficiency gains, where we took red meat production, what's happened to our dairy industry.
The catchphrase of diversification to survive, it was literally created in the agricultural sense in the 80s.
So it was a challenging time, though, as students trying to get work. So my first job was as a nutritionist for a pig and poultry company in Auckland.
Oh, wow.
It was. I figured out fairly quickly that wasn't my lifelong ambition.
Yeah, wow.
We could grow great Christmas chickens. But that was a great fundamental training in monogastric nutrition and least cost modelling. Yeah. But I was enticed back to the pastoral sector with the opportunity to do a PhD. Then, of course, we had the share market crash of 87, and we thought, Graham Burrell said, you'll be finished your PhD just at the right time. But you were in there in the 90s. The New Zealand economy was pretty flat, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, we started at Lincoln College in 89, and I think our class in Ag Sci had only 19 people in it at that moment. And I think
we'd just graduated and we were more than double your class size.
Yeah, so that was the indication of exactly how agriculture was vibing at the end of the 80s.
And it was really interesting. At that time, there was a lot of that whole idea of being a productionist, where you were out in the paddock and you were actually trying to be more efficient at producing an end product, was starting to dwindle, and there were people going to the lab looking at DNA technology, and there was a lot of lab-based work that was
a little bit of that was the restructuring of the CRSOs at that moment, wasn't it?
I was gone by then, so I had shot
your
through.
PhD, cut back to that. You started a PhD
in the late 80s on the impact of gastrointestinal parasites on feed intake in lambs.
Oh, wow.
Wow, that's got no relevance today, has it?
Funny that, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Oh, right back. In fact, it's interesting when I talk about this, commercially, it's some of that really fundamental stuff from Lincoln about those life cycles and the impact that forage has that we still talk about.
And, what happens to protein in the gut in those lambs. So my work came in the back of that, and feed intake was emerging as I guess we'd been trying to predict intake in animals for a long time, hadn't we? So it was of a time.
So we still are.
How ironic is it? There's still a little bit of that going on.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
And so that's quite a cool, that was a very interesting PhD topic. From there though, you ended up where?
I ended up with CSIRO animal production in Western Australia.
Wow.
And that was part of CSIRO's move to decentralise its science and actually to put its science out where the levy paying money was coming from. So that saw the Western Australian laboratories grow across livestock and cropping and pastoral at that time. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So what was the topic specifically that got you over there?
So I went into a role, it was actually replacing someone that Juddy will know, which was Bob Weston, R.H. Weston, published 15 foundational papers on ruminant nutrition. His role was shifted to WA. So he came and he and I worked together for 3 months.
Wow.
Wow, was right. Yeah. And that was around the fundamentals of intake regulation. And when you're in the Mediterranean, it's a whole different world. It's an annual-based system. You go from bare ground to abundance of high-quality feed. You have all those challenges when the rain starts. The animals charge around looking for green pick. It destroys fibre, strength, and wool. Yeah. There are all, and then you run out of feed, and you end up with all this dead, dry feed. So I was given a very salient piece of advice by Limbo Thompson, which was when you go to WA, don't tell them you know how to bleed a sheep. Because I'm not particularly tall, right? And the frame on those merinos in WA is massive, which makes sense because if it's feast and famine, then you need a big frame to hang a lot of protein off, right? And a lot of fat. Yeah. So it was a massive learning curve. And of course, in WA, you've got the dairy zone, the sheep zone, the sheep wheat sheep, and then wheat. And I arrived just when further inland was getting rid of the sheep. And they proved how quickly you can get herbicide resistance.
Yeah, because they didn't have a grazing system.
The extreme model gives you such a great opportunity to see what happens. Yeah.
So what were the chunky challenges in Western Australia at the time? So
when I first went there, my work was focused on the plant-animal interface and how the changing, and it's a annual ryegrass, subterranean clover dominated. In fact, I think it's the place to breed subclover, isn't it, guys?
Yeah, I think it is. Absolutely. Yep. South Australia
and WA.
WA.
Yeah. So initially that real challenge was what are we doing around how we manage these pastures, and then And then we got quite quickly into working with the plant breeders.
I assume reliability in a non-reliable landscape was a bigger part of that topic.
Reliability. So there's a couple of things that go on. One is we worked on a site with funded by GRDC, the Grains Corporation. They wanted phase farming that put a lot of nitrogen into the soil for 4 years, then grow wheat. Yeah. We saw that the only way to do that was to have a really complex blend of legumes, because it's such a highly seasonal, high variability that the only way you got success was to have a big mix of hard-seededness, of flowering time, of seed size, all of those things. And so we built sheep systems around that.
To protect against false strikes.
False break is the biggest challenge.
And literally losing, if you invest in one style, you'd lose the whole of the buried seed if it germinated on a false strike and had a 42-degree day for the next 2 weeks afterwards. They're all dead.
Correct. Yeah. And so you go out, set up to run a legume trial, and all you can see is capeweed as far as the eye can see. Yeah. But then you learn the capeweed will run out of nitrogen and your clover will appear.
Yeah. Still a cycle.
It's still a cycle. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So interesting. From there?
So from there, the first commercialization project that we jumped into was building on feeding value and nutritive value. So we had a really well set up lab. We started working with Australia's biggest oat and hay exporter, Gilmac, and they are based out of Western Australia. And we convinced them quite readily, they were easily to convince, that they could start putting standards around their hay, not based on smell, colour and touch, but based on objective measurement. So actually very quickly, we put objective measurement into their market. Within 18 months, they were getting $20 a tonne premium at the time. That was on 500,000 tonnes. They now export over 1 million tonnes. So they set a new standard in objective measurement. Now, with the late 90s, early 2000s, we've been doing objective measurement for a long time. And yet this was an opportunity to put it into a high-value market in a way when they had choice in product. So they could set a standard and the farmers met it or not.
So am I right to say that this is predominantly targeting indoor cow feeding in countries that don't have the production base to supply these?
At the time, all of Australia's oat and hay exports were going into Japan. Yeah. And going to Japan for the dairy cow market. So it was a high-value market, high-quality product. And, of course, you will appreciate in that very defined growing season that is Australia, it's relatively easy to grow a consistent product. Mm. You don't have too many problems with rainfall when you want to cut it and bale it, for example. I mean, if you do, it's catastrophic because you've just had a big rainfall event, but most of the time you don't. And perhaps not surprisingly, the most consistent hay came out of the shortest growing season environment. And I think that was down to consistency.
Yeah, time of shut off. And it was not maturing any days extra because it was so consistent year on year.
Correct.
And I think that sounds like the measurement system became quite powerful because, relatively speaking, it's a low quality fibre, but being valued for having the high quality, range. Being so consistent created the value.
So you have to be in Western Australia to think that oat and hay is high quality feed, right?
Yeah, well, this is
it's all about context. Yeah. It's just like we'd go over east for a conference and we'd remember driving through ACT and they said, it's a really bad drought. Yeah, the wheat crop's looking crap. And we're like, it's damn good to us.
This is amazing. Yeah.
It's all about context. Yeah.
100%.
So it's a modest quality feed, but incredibly important when it's the fibre source for those Japanese cows that they will eat it every day.
Yeah.
So when you changed lines, you needed them to keep eating it. So they were able to offer a money-back guarantee. And what we had done was they stopped shipping the really high quality, of which there was very few lines, but none of the very poor quality. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting when you consider here we are in New Zealand today and we don't trade our silages on quality. And partly, not always, but partly because it's a more consistently high quality range, although that's not.
So we claim.
And that's the issue. Until you don't open the bale, you actually don't know what you've just paid for.
And then I worry, and Juddy, you'll understand this. I worry that we think that a ME of 11.2 is different from an ME of 11.5. We need to remind ourselves of the underlying chemistry and the methods that we get those numbers, and we're forgetting that, and that's dangerous game.
Yeah, it is, and I guess it does hark back to the some of the early work in terms of describing exactly what digestibility is. There's been a wonderful technology boom where we've been able to estimate some of that to high degrees of accuracy, forgetting that the actual figure doesn't have a high degree of accuracy.
Correct. And one of our problems in WA was that our standards were all built below 60% digestibility. So the first thing we had to do was improve our standards, but we had the funding to do that.
Yeah.
So at the same time, I was working with the agronomists and the plant breeders and the farm system scientists, bringing that kind of measurement technology alongside the plant breeding. And in Mediterranean, so interesting. So they would be collecting different cultivars and species from around the world. You know, the holy grail was to get a feed that would still be there in autumn.
Yeah, so something that could build up a mass, survive the hot summers and still be utilisable in situ.
Correct.
In the autumn.
Correct. And, the legumes work really well because, as we know, when they dry off, they're still high quality. Yeah.
You've almost created standing hay.
Correct. But if you're running these first farmer I met, I said, how big's your farm? And he said 12,000 hectares. And I'm like, right.
Yeah.
So I used to have to ask how many people worked on the farm. So these guys are routinely running, 5,000 head of animals per person, 5, 7, 8,000, turning them all over and they get foot rot because it's a notifiable disease, go figure. But the thing is, they're often set stocking. So if it's all grazed out by autumn, which enabled us to do some quite smart thinking around, you can have something that's less palatable if it's there in autumn. And then as herbicide resistance emerged, I was helping the PhD students working on, what mix would you put in so that the annual ryegrasses were the preferred thing for the animals to graze as a control technique. So when you've run out of spray, when you run out of chemical, how might you use grazing management? And there's enough...
How topical is that today?
Well, over here, isn't it ironic? Yeah. But there's enough highly unpalatable plants that come out of the Mediterranean. And, of course, WA at the time was doing the work on Tagasasti. And, Tagasasti could grow beef at 1 to 1.5 kilos a day until moisture stress came, and then it became a maintenance feed. So we had some good student work at the time, understanding, what was happening in the room and what was happening in the plants with condensed tannins and polyphenolics that were leading to this overnight switch. Yeah. So it's a climate, it's a climate that makes diamonds. Yeah. It's a climate that has an overnight switch in a way that we don't understand.
And it's a climate that really makes you think carefully about building a feed system, recognising quality for one phase is okay, but the reality is there's huge value for having maintenance at another phase. And you can't rule something out because it was low quality at that phase, but it was actually a higher poor quality at a standing phase at a later date. So building feed systems based on an environment like that is amazing.
But I think also what it does, if you take a bit of a wider view, right, what a great location to get the contrast. Typically when we're doing this
you couldn't build that in New Zealand. Contrast of experience.
Because you get that huge contrast, and that from a research point of view in terms of understanding how the animal responds to that, what's happening in the rumen, all of those things, you try and generate those big differences, and it's in those environments that they are handed to you almost.
Absolutely, and that's that big rangy animal. That's what survives and thrives in that environment.
Put a hay shed on the back.
Exactly. You go over the East Coast and they're a much smaller animal. Yeah.
Oh, Robyn, that's an amazing way to start, because the reality is you've cut your teeth on so many animal production philosophies and concepts tied up in feed systems right from the start. Where did that go from there? Because that wasn't all you.
No. So the late 1990s was when secondary salinity. So the Australian landscapes always had primary salinity, and so that's where you see those small areas that are white with salt on the surface, which is really, and they are ecologically extremely important. What we were seeing was secondary salinity. So post the early 1900s, Western Australia was cleared of trees and become wheat farms predominantly. What happens and rainfall becomes very low to non-existent after October. And that's the same time you harvest the wheat. So after October, there is nothing in those landscapes now pumping water, which meant that the water table comes up.
Yeah.
And it's an ancient weathered.
Which is contrary to your rainfall and or your temperature regime.
Correct. So water table was coming up in the 1990s, and what was happening was regional towns, their old brick buildings were getting crumbly because the salt water was coming up into the mortar that holds the bricks together. So it was becoming a political challenge, and it's highly visible in the landscape as well. Yeah. So that was a major issue in Western Australia, and a much smaller, lesser issue in the eastern states.
Well, I started travelling in 98, and I was very, young, bright-eyed Kiwi at that stage, and I was literally prepping myself on salinity on that eastern seaboard because that was the topic of the early 90s. Full stop. I mean, salinity through the production zones of the Hamilton area, the Goulburn Valley and northern Victoria was a massive topic. And I was fascinated because I think the topic must have been at its focal peak in the mid-90s to about that time frame,
correct,
98, because pretty much as soon as I turned up, the topic just disappeared because what happened in the eastern seaboard all dried down for the next decade. So there's no high water tables to create the up and down part in the Goulburn Valley, which is an irrigated out of the Murray system, out of the Midder. That had high water table all the way through to the mid-90s, and then that just declined afterwards.
And that was such an interesting time because I had colleagues working in viticulture.
Yeah.
And they had a measurable amount of water left. Then it was all gone in some of the most valuable parts of the wine-producing part of South Australia. Their research, with research under pressure of the water resources nearly gone, they developed methods to put a quarter of the water on they'd been putting on previously.
Yeah.
So
efficiencies.
So needs must in that situation in a way that we don't understand in New Zealand, I think, is fair to say. Meanwhile, in the West, we already had much bigger areas. So the East had the Goulburn Valley, had the Murray-Darling, and those big urban centres at the end that were reliant on fresh potable water. Over in the West, far more extensive areas of secondary salinity and putting those small regional towns under pressure. So we had a different set of drivers, and we didn't have that. It was a different. We like to think of ourselves as quite different in the West. There is still a movement in the West to become independent because it's got enough wealth, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that was an interesting time because our research, if anything, ramped up. And so you had the CRC, there was the legumes, Klima, Mediterranean legume CRC was first.
Program. Yep.
And then the second one was a salinity CRC. And that was the one set up that had an agronomy and plant breeding focus. And I was one of the two people that actually brought the animals component into it because by then we'd done the work and it was really clear the only future for that secondary saline areas in WA was under livestock.
Yeah.
So we went back and said, should we be twin calving cows? Should we be mating hoggets? Challenging because you've got to grow them out enough. Hard in that environment. So we were looking at the livestock-based systems that would deliver. And remembering it's a situation that you get to January, February, March, and you're trying to grow weaners out. And by March, you're down to bare boards.
Yeah.
And so we had farmers who were growing barley grass. So when the secondary salinity comes in, kind of your grass that remains the longest is the barley grass. And that can be their best early season production. So then they'll come in and mow it and just drop it down and leave it sitting and then graze it when they need to.
Oh, so they hay that off on top of the ground, literally?
Left it sitting because they knew they didn't want to get the seed heads.
Yes.
But it was a safe early season. So we started a program on saltbush. Saltbush had been in the landscape for a long time. And there was work saying that animals were heavier when they grazed saltbush. And of course, you're probably aware of the work that actually what we were seeing was the additional water loading from a high salt diet. Yeah. So we went back into the animal house and did some fundamental research to understand what happened when you fed up to 30% salt. It also was the nutritive value testing became unsuitable because you go outside the acceptable range for ash content. So we had to go back and do quite a lot of
sodium chloride minerals.
Yeah.
So your ash content's normally 11, 12, 13%. It would be over 30%.
Wow.
So the guys in the East Coast were saying to us, we've got this high quality feed and yet the animals are not growing because they've got year-round grazing on saltbush on the east. So the laboratory values suggested they should be growing, but you had to look at organic matter digestibility, not digestibility.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah. So,
and again, a really good example of not getting outside of the parameters on which you have developed your models.
Your assays, exactly. So but the advantage of CSIRO back in the day was we had the funding and the laboratory facilities to have 250 animals in individual pens, to have a full laboratory doing all the wet chemistry, so we could go back and sort out the fundamentals and then partner with the State Department of Ag guys with on-farm testing. So we ended up with really significant funding across Australia, and we had the laboratory-based analysis going on. We had animal house feeding. We had students. We had PhD students. We had field sites, and attached to the field sites, we'd have up to 6 farmer-led research groups, and they would do a split paddock comparison, and they'd have a State Department technician supporting them, and they'd have their mailbox in the paddock.
The infrastructure is amazing.
Oh, the funding and the infrastructure, it was quite. It's on a scale that we don't fully appreciate. It was quite challenging. We're out there with our animals in the plots, and my colleagues had the big CSIRO core driller there taking the cores, and it had come out of the minerals team. And in the end, I said to the farmers, let's go and have a look, because, it was drilling down like 100 metres, and I was trying to get farmers to pay attention to me, and all they could see was the water spouts behind them. So we had that kind of interaction. But the smartest thing I ever did there was we were working with hydrologists, and they wanted to work on 100-hectare plots, and I wanted 1-hectare plots. We settled on 10-hectare plots. Now, that was about 5 hours from Perth, and we couldn't get a fencing contractor, and by then I had kids. So I rang up the local primary school and said, look, I've got $15,000. Is there any chance you could fence some plots for us? So these farming teams went out and fenced these plots for us. They turned up to every field day for the next 4 years.
This is the farming.
So
families.
we had like 50 farmers came in, and so they had these teams. You can imagine what it's like. Yeah. So this competition to each build the plots, right?
Oh, fantastic.
And then they came back. And you can imagine if you've had kids at school. Back then, 25 years ago, $15,000, and all that, we paid for the materials. They just had to pay for the labour.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
But they kept coming back.
What a great way of connecting to the community.
Exactly.
And to be fair, there's an element of that sort of flowed through a lot of your work and the way you approach your work back in New Zealand. From the salt salinity projects and time, what happened after that?
So the salinity projects,
I assume that's the end of the 2000s? End of the 90s?
That's right. I was working on that right up until I came back to New Zealand, in fact.
Yeah, so that's
2004, came back to New Zealand, yeah.
Wow, because it was actually really disappearing on the eastern seaboard by the early 2000s, the whole topic of salinity. It was obviously that, like you described, the hotspots of salinity were known to be hotspots of salinity, but the broader threat of salinity had really sort of settled on the eastern
east coast.
Absolutely.
Yes. On the, in Western Australia, it's still an issue. And that original saltbush work we did 5 years ago, my former colleagues actually put a commercial saltbush into the market, and that's one that was selected to be higher palatability.
From that time
From
frame.
the very original work we did 25 years ago. It took 20 years to put a commercial product in.
Absolutely. Fully appreciate that, Robyn.
Yeah, well, you will.
Yeah. So now coming back to New Zealand, what were the chunky research themes that you came back to?
Especially in the 2000s. We'll build this one by decades.
So remembering I came back fully understanding that the urban dweller controlled the world. that politics had a big part to play in research.
So a lot of that was built on...
So it was really the experiences of salinity and just seeing how political it came quite quickly, and how there was a need to address visual amenity, a need to be able to talk about the pathway forward we had and the metrics that we had to measure. So we were doing spider counts and ant counts and frog calls. So we were having to demonstrate that our saline areas would contribute to bird corridors,
the greater ecology.
The greater ecology, and remembering you're in areas with a lot of native birds, native species. Let alone learning to navigate field work, knowing the snakes were all around you.
Lots of deadly things all around you.
So I came back with that really clear view, and I guess I came into a time when, Central Plains water was being talked about. New Zealand was, I guess, starting to see the emergence of a few things like regulation around water quality. So I think I came back at the time when the Huranui was under discussion, Selwyn, Te Waihora and Hines. I was a little bit separate to that, but I did step into the early work with farmer groups around understanding climate change and greenhouse gases. And of course, I've been away for so long, I then have to say to farmers here, how big is your farm? How many people does it support? Because I've been immersed in something so different for so long.
So different,
Things here were on a scale and an intensity that I had to rethink. Yeah.
And to be fair, we're approaching sort of like peak intensification. We had a couple of the conversion phases in the South Island, particularly through the 90s and early 2000s. And I think you arrived just at the start of another secondary or tertiary expansion phase in the South Island.
It was a pretty cool time too, because Tom Fraser had already rolled out Forage Master.
Yep.
And we did Flock Master. And that was a lesson in what happens when the market crashes and you're trying to work with farmers. Yeah. So that was a lot about bringing some of that fundamental principles of science back into some workshop and tools that could add more impact and value for farming. So we had, there was a lot of discussion about hogget mating. All of those things were going on when I stepped back in. And also, AgResearch with its social science teams, Gavin Sheath and Greg Lambert had built up, had really seen the need to have social science as part of farm systems. And that was really my first opportunity.
Had that really just been put together in the 2010s?
No, earlier. They were in the 90s coming into the 2000s. Yeah. And that was an opportunity that I hadn't had at CSIRO, that they didn't have that same integration. And CSIRO wasn't strong on farming systems. It's become strong, but it wasn't then. So coming into a farming systems team, sitting alongside the Endophyte team, starting to work alongside and with farmers and having farmer focus groups was a huge opportunity to see where we were going to have an impact from our science. And at the time, we could go out and work. So we had 12 farmer groups throughout New Zealand, and we worked with them over the whole 3 years around understanding climate change and understanding greenhouse gases. And it was the farmers quite really said, this is not fair, because at the time we were going into the ETS. Yeah. And my position was this: let's together understand the facts. Let's understand where the emissions come from on your farms, what your management, what's associated with the landscape you're in, and what's due to your management choices. Then once you've got that knowledge, let's run scenarios. What do you think you might do in response? Oh, well, we'll mate our hoggets. Okay, so let's then run some models and look at what that means. And then we ended up having MPI officials have to come out and meet with our farmer groups, because then our farmer groups wanted to share their learning. And that was really powerful for me, because they moved on from not fear to, we want to show you the numbers. We want to show you how few choices we have.
And that's still in the 2000s.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is a really important thing to recognise, is how fast things started to move and change in the 2000s. And these were the first people that were being engaged with AgResearch on this topic as a whole. Everyone was starting to react to what was coming, and react in many different ways. But this is the first part of I would describe almost as the educational phase of what was coming.
That's right. That's right. And it was interesting for me because I'd come out of that whole political thing in Australia and that need in Australia to make sure the social benefits beyond the farm gates was clear, because the urban dwellers had all of the power basically and they needed to be happy. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting.
And in WA, if you worked for the State Department of Agriculture and the State Minister wasn't happy with you, he sent you to Kalgoorlie, which happened to one of my colleagues. You may laugh.
In the middle of nowhere.
So the late 2000s, I think we were in that productivity phase. There was still a lot of dairy conversions going on. You know, if you think through the 2007 GFC,
yes,
you know, we came through that remarkably well because of dairy expansion, didn't we?
Virtually untouched in the world. And we're very closeted to what it meant to the rest of the world. But
That's
we were
right.
one of the few economies that didn't
and
even.
We had Pastoral 21, which was the government industry partnership funding. And if you look at that's quite telling really, because in the sheep and beef side of that, we were looking at increasing ME in hill country. Yeah. You know,
the start of that journey,
because we could see then, and, you know, perhaps not a lot's changed, that opportunity to grow animals faster, to finish more animals, the value of that higher quality feed in hill country.
I think we'd already, as a whole industry, started to see that, like, the New Zealand landscape was a bit of a chessboard going on, really.
Yes.
And I felt that was where the messaging in the New Zealand landscape was, that the sheep industry just wasn't profitable enough to stay on the high quality elements of the land, and it was going to mean that we were moving more and more into different landscapes, of which we needed to empower those landscapes to be more profitable.
And of course, we'd seen the loss of a lot of conversion in Canterbury to dairying, hadn't we? So we'd seen the loss of that lamb finishing land. I guess here for us, accelerating at quite a rapid rate. So that really brought us a focus to that. And at the same time, remembering that the P21 farmlet trials and the dairying moved into that lower input, more efficient, higher per animal performance focus. And I think some of that work, and we were working with funding from NZAGRC at the time, and we did some of the first work on understanding the variability in greenhouse gas emissions across sheep and beef farms.
Which is probably a perfect segue into 210s, because the world sort of, I wouldn't say pivoted, but changed, because we started on that topic at the end of the 2000s, and then the 210s came along, and I wouldn't say things disappeared.
Well, I guess we started to come under more pointed challenge around water quality. Yeah. So, you know, this is when there was a lot of discussion and engagement going on across the country, really, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And so that was ramping up. So some of the work we were starting to do was looking at the sweet spot. But, well, we were coming into forages of reduced nitrate leaching was on the horizon. And that was the work that focused in on plantain, of course. And I was part of the team working with the monitor farms. So we had arable, sheep and beef and dairy monitor farms. And those were farmers that we interviewed really carefully to find farmers who would engage with the research as it came out. You know, one of our sheep and beef farmers was an absolute classic, because we'd go out and have a conversation, and Scobie and I go back the next time and half a paddock would have gone into whatever we've been talking about, which was
reacted almost immediately.
But I think that was a great learning experience. And for us in the sheep and beef sector, you know, just some of those challenges of getting plantain into the sheep and beef sector because of how they run their systems, and taking them on that journey of what you guys were talking about, how you graze it. It's great until you put it in a system that comes under pressure, whether it's the human pressure or the climate, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we had, I think, a lot of learnings out of FRNL, and I think the monitor farm work led by Ina Pinksterhouse was a great example of working really closely with farmers and taking them on a learning journey with us.
And to be fair, the 210s, I look back on that phase and I feel you yourself and the groups that you've been involved with, that'd probably be one of the cornerstones really of a lot of what you have done through that phase, is actually work in the community.
That's right.
Forming relationships and actually getting the cut through via
it's really interesting.
Interesting groups.
You know, that's when that's that sort of the monitor farm or the case study really took off. And if you think about even some of the research that's happening today, it's still the once you've done your fundamental research, it's still that next step where you go out onto farm and you actually look at across a number of different farms how that fundamental research is then commercialized, if you like, or put out into commercial situation.
Almost taking compartmentalized research, and then
but it's almost now when you do a research project, it's almost a component that you've got to think about that you will have to go and do that at some point, and that was the start of it.
And look, I think it's not without its challenges. And I look at what you guys are doing at Marshall. You've got this nice intermediate space. If we look back actually prior to our time, if you look back to the systems trials that used to run at Winchmore, at Ballantrae, at Woodlands,
Marama, Tara Hills,
right up and down the country. Then the conversations that were able to be had around those systems trials that were going on, we then entered a phase, and Wharabeat's been part of that, when the farming community was ahead of the research. Yep. And I think we've lost a lot by finding ourselves in that situation. And I hope as we go forward, we find pathways that enable the research to be timely enough to be of high value, because crops like Wharabeat, they have many unique characteristics that we need in our toolbox, and we need to have them fitting in. We need to understand whatever we're trying to do in systems, we need to de-risk it for the farmers. And I don't think we always get it right when we go from the plots to putting it out on the farms. We lose that chance to learn what we've got to learn.
And to package it up.
Well, you need the packaging.
Package
and
it
I
up
always
more appropriately.
I always think of Balanza Clover in Western Australia.
Yeah.
They put it out and it was a flop until they said, as long as you graze it here, it'll work perfectly. Yeah. So we've got to have those key fundamentals right, and we've got to understand what it means for the systems right.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a great analogy.
And I think, I coming back to that whole idea that we've lost this idea, or lost this job title, if you like, of the productionist, the person that actually understands those farm systems. We've sort of gone from the plot, and you're absolutely right. There's this bit missing in the middle that we are now expecting some of these innovative farmers to help us understand.
Would you have called that extension in the past, an extension element?
Yes, you would have done.
Because to be fair, that was what was stripped out of the government system through the late 80s and early 90s was the whole extension function. And to be fair, you've actually recreated that from a scientist.
Well, we've sort of come through the back door, haven't we?
Yeah, you have.
And I do think one of the strengths in co-design with farmers is we have to be a lot better at answering the questions farmers have.
Yeah.
Not the question we know they should want to know.
Yeah, not just your
there's a
question,
difference, not just my question.
Yeah. So true. That's a really
and look,
strong
that's
process.
One of my roles in AgResearch as a farm systems scientist is to look at the discipline-based research, the excellent research my colleagues do in components, and discuss and debate and challenge around what will we need to deliver that in a system. Yeah. Because at the centre of that system are people making a whole range of decisions, right?
And I suppose this is where we have some really interesting conversations
with
time on exactly the sort of wheelhouse that we sort of interact with. I think in a previous life, that's where we'd have been. Yeah. Maybe you might not have been. I might have been somewhere in that system.
We've been fortunate to, with things like the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Centre, and, Harry Clark did put funding into farm systems as well as into the greenhouse gases, and I think that has been important. That continues now with rural professionals. I think we needed to start that work because we needed to bring that understanding how few choices you have when you're a sheep and beef farmer around your livestock. It's got to be about your whole system and your land uses, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So that really covers the first part of the 210s.
Yeah.
But then it also, the water peaked.
So water
and then
peaked.
Suddenly it changed.
Well, water peaked, and we were doing tranche 1 and 2 of our land and water. So in tranche 1, we looked at next generation systems. What are the options for the future? We here in Canterbury can grow pretty much anything, right?
Yeah, hydroponics.
that's not our challenge for New Zealand. New Zealand's challenge is, one, having enough capital to get it in and build the supply chain we need, and two, having markets that we need them to want it and we need them to pay a high enough price. And if I have had one frustration in the last 7 or 8 years, it's been this, we're just going to transform our landscapes. We'll transform our landscapes. Really? How are we going to achieve that? We've been changing land use through time. That will continue, and it will have to be market-led. I think it raises some really important questions about who's going to invest where to enable us to move into some of those high-value markets where we need a whole supply chain of investment.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's been the flaw of everyone waiting for other industries to emerge in New Zealand, because if you don't have the full infrastructure,
correct,
those industries, we can build a country based on niche businesses where you can value them very highly, but they're not an answer for large parts of our country unless we have the full infrastructure.
Look, we've got the oat milk industry, which is quite a new industry, and I've had some people discuss oat milk. Look, if people want to pay significant value for a litre of oat milk, we can grow it. We've got very good quality water to produce it. We just need 50 or 100 oat milk type industries to give us real other choice in our land use, right? So look, that then led us in, we finished last year our land and water, and I led Whiti Whiti Ora, which is land use suitability, recognising that we used to talk about what we could do with land use change, but recognising that as we understand more about environmental drivers and set higher standards for what we desire from our environments, there will be some land, the options we put in must be suitable for the land. And that's really how they're going to impact on the receiving air and water and landscapes. And what we've done is put together the data supermarket. There's 800 data files in there. So recognising it's not just about profit now. So that's got environmental footprints. It's got some really hard to find data on relative costs of production and relative potential returns. And it's got some cards in there to tell you how to go and update the data. But that's trying to make high quality data available to any rural professional who wants to use it, and any farming group and commercial groups that want it. Yes.
I think it's so interesting because that also leads on to that big pivot and change probably in the start of the 2020s, associated with actually the government's probably stepped back quite a bit from some of this, and the consumer has swept in. Well, no, maybe not even the consumer, but the customer has swept in and started to take leadership in this space.
Look, isn't it so interesting? And, I think from where we were sitting, all of us, it was relatively easy to see the global pressure was going to come on around a focus on lower carbon futures. You could see that coming. We were very invested in water, but I was saying to farmers, I think we're going to be talking more about low carbon futures. That was easy to see. And we always say there'll be less happens in 2 years than you expect, but more in 10. But I don't think I picked the rate of change from when we were working on costings for greenhouse gases under He Waka Eke Noa to where we've got to with customer incentives now available for dairy farmers. That's happened since 2020, hasn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
And I think we need to look and reflect, because we need them to want us, and we've got a choice. But gosh, what a great choice we've got, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's a significant theme change, though, because we've been discussing government-driven
that's right
research and levels, but now we're discussing consumer or customer led change and decisions, which technically could create a faster change because, to be fair, they should be willing to pay for it to a degree. But this is where the tension comes in all the discussions, is that it's still sometimes difficult to see who actually ends up paying for it.
And it's really interesting right now, isn't it? Because who ends up paying for it? Because we've got the banks, we've got the processing companies, we've got all parts of society wanting to demonstrate their pathway to a lower carbon future. And they're all looking to the farmers to be part of that. And yet, who's paying the cost of getting there? That's a really interesting point, isn't it? I think
second half of the decade, do you reckon?
Well, and I think we've got a bit of a vulnerability in that there's a lot of focus at the moment on low carbon. But those customers assume we've got our biodiversity, we've got our water quality, we're feeding our children. Yeah. They're assuming a lot of other things. So we as a country and as food producers, the continuous improvement need is still there, isn't it?
A culture of
continuous improvement and a culture of telling our story, but increasingly having the data to back it up.
Yeah, I think that's still king moving forward. I can't see a future where we don't tell our story, which we've been doing forever in New Zealand within reason, but with the data to back it up. It's no longer good just to have lip service, but the reality is you've got a data set, you've got facts to support your environmental position or your ecological position or your production system efficacy.
It's such an interesting time where we are in this, I don't know how you want to describe the world we're in around data and science and distrust. And one of the conversations I've been having with some of my trusted farmers is, I trust you as farmers that you will produce high quality, safe food. You can't control everything in your pipeline. You're going to have to trust other parts, others.
That's right.
Because to throw your hands up and say, we don't trust anybody, we have to figure out where our trusted models are, don't we?
Absolutely.
And be a degree of reciprocity. I've got a trusted relationship with you. I trust the food that you produce. You're not sure about the science that we're doing. Let's have a conversation. Let's build conversations. Let's build understanding.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably where, to some extent, Marshdale has become a really useful tool for us, because it's not only saying, we have some science that may interest some of our clients, but what we're saying, I guess, is come along and have a look. I think the ability to engage with farmers in terms of change, but not just talk at them, but actually go on the journey with them. And I think the theme coming through here is really not so much the science, but the way that's delivered and the way that it's used and actually bringing farmers along in the journey. And you see that a lot where if you are able to demonstrate and get buy-in from farmers, the cut through in terms of that technology is so much higher than if you are trying to either throw that at them, or even worse, trying to force them to use it.
West Australian fencing project.
Exactly.
Really,
so we're coming. So you come back to that.
Look, I think we need to try and summarise this, because I look at it and I think I quite often see big pictures and look at where we've been and what we're doing, never in isolation. Mm-hmm. And I look at and I keep going back to the 80s and just can't emphasise enough what the word diversification meant to the 80s. It meant if New Zealand didn't leave the subsidised world of agricultural intensification, and diversify was the catchphrase, that agriculture was a sunset industry, were the catchphrases of the 80s. If you didn't diversify, you weren't going to survive. We all came out of that phase. And again, the industries were flat, but momentum was building and was recreating as diversification kicked in. And in this one, you could say the start of the hort industry, the emergence of the dairy industry into the South Island, creating stimulus in the South Island of New Zealand. But it still highlights categorically that whole pain, the catchphrase of the 80s being diversification to survive was a big deal. You look at your experience in Australia, and I just think what a wonderful basis for starting careers, coming from a parasite program into factors affecting intake, factors of creating proprietary products and added value products from the oat and hay, the oat market. And then looking at all the interaction between the social interaction of looking at what it meant to integrate feeds into a very tough landscape that's actually very defined as well.
Correct.
Across that West Australian landscape. You've got the zones that are like black and white, literally by the road, wherever those landscapes are. And I feel that was probably something that I also watched the salinity discussion emerge. on both sides of Australia, but meaning more for the West Australia than it finally meant for the eastern seaboard. So those 2 decades were quite interesting from the development perspective. I think the 2000s were a pretty heady time because we're still dealing with production-based scenarios, but we're also looking at the future issues. We're measuring water for the first time in New Zealand. We were seeing the emissions rules and discussion was starting to really get momentum. 2010s.
Yeah. Actually, a couple of questions from me.
Yeah.
Just to finish off. What advice would you give yourself as you were coming out of a PhD? What advice from now would you give your young self as you were coming out of a PhD?
The advice to my young self would be leave New Zealand. Go and immerse yourself in a different production system.
Find your West Australia.
Find your West Australia. Yeah.
Wow.
Find your West Australia.
And I guess question leading on to that, there's probably some people out there listening who are, going through their university careers and looking ahead. What advice would you give them? It's
passion and interest carry you a long way. Network, connect. If you want a network and connect, invest in yourself, invest in learning, invest in surrounding yourself with mentors and connections, and create a trusted environment where you can always find a friend.
Awesome. Well, I agree, Alice. We're gonna have to wrap this up.
Yeah.
I felt some energy in the room, and I think that we haven't lost that. So listen, thank you, Robyn, for filling the last hour with a lot of energy. I think we've transgressed a number of different decades.
Yeah.
It's been, for me, it's been fascinating to learn about those different research themes, and I hope it's been interesting to our listeners.
I think so. I'm really thankful for you being with us today because, like I say, that journey sort of still represents quite a defining sort of change in the way things are happening,
isn't it?
And I just can't. I'm fascinated by the next 5 years of this decade, but I've already got eyes on the 30s to understand what that world would look like because it's going to be fascinating.
All right. Hope to catch you on another podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, team.